Nobody talks about what actually happened in the 3 seconds before the photograph. Everyone saw the photograph. The whole world saw the photograph. It ran in 47 countries on the front page, cropped and color-corrected and slapped beneath headlines that competed to out-breathless each other. But photographs are liars by profession. They freeze the after and erase the before, and the before is the only part that mattered. The before is what I keep turning over in my hands like a coin I found and can't identify. Heads or tails, I still don't know what it means. What I know is what I saw, and what I saw started not with a ring, not with Catherine, and not even with Camilla. It started with a window. The east wing of the palace has a particular quality of light in late morning, not the golden Instagram warmth people imagine when they think of royal residences, but something older and more uncertain, like the light in an oil painting that hasn't been cleaned in 2 centuries. It comes through glass that's been there since before anyone currently living was born, and it lands on everything at a slightly wrong angle, making familiar faces look stranger than they are, making ordinary gestures look like they're being performed for an audience that left the room 100 years ago. I had been standing near the corridor entrance for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I checked my watch twice, once when I arrived, once when I started wondering if I'd been forgotten, and the gap between the two was 11 minutes exactly. 11 minutes in a corridor like that feels different from 11 minutes anywhere else. The air doesn't move. The carpet absorbs sound in a way that feels deliberate, as though sound itself has been trained to behave. You become very aware of your own breathing. There were 4 of us waiting, if you count the 2 aides who stood with the particular stillness of people who have learned to be furniture. I don't count the aides. There were 2 of us waiting. James, I'll call him James, that's not his name, but the shape of him was a James, broad through the shoulders and perpetually slightly confused in a way that suggested old money, and good schools had prepared him beautifully for a world that no longer quite existed. James was looking at his phone with the dedication of a man who wanted to appear busy. He wasn't busy. He was reading the same notification he'd already read 4 times. I could tell because his thumb kept making the same small upward flick, going nowhere. I was looking at the window. The window looked out onto the inner courtyard, and from where I stood I could see the edge of the garden, not much of it, just a strip of green, wet from the morning's rain, catching the weak November light in a way that made it look almost luminous. There was a bird on the gravel. A pigeon, gray and entirely unbothered by where it had chosen to be. I remember thinking, that pigeon has no idea. It has absolutely no idea what is about to happen 20 feet above its head. Neither did I, if I'm being honest. The invitation had come through the proper channels. Everything in that world comes through proper channels, which is to say it arrives already slightly depersonalized, language smoothed to a neutral finish, the human being who sent it barely visible beneath the formality. The purpose was described as an informal working gathering connected to a charitable initiative Catherine had been expanding for the better part of 3 years. I had been involved at the periphery, a researcher, a quiet contributor to the background architecture of the thing, not the sort of person whose name appears in the public-facing documents, but the sort of person whose work shows up in them anyway, unattributed and absorbed. I mention this only to explain why I was there and why my presence was, in the hierarchy of that morning, entirely unremarkable. Camilla's presence was also described, in the aide's pre-meeting briefing, as unremarkable. She had an adjacent engagement in the building. She would be passing through. The word used was literally passing through, as though she were weather. That word would become, later, privately, something James and I found very funny. She was not passing through. I heard Catherine before I saw her. Not her voice, though that came a moment later, that particular cadence she has, warm and precise at the same time, like a tuning fork that also knows how to laugh. What I heard first was the change in the corridor's atmosphere. The air that had been still simply rearranged itself. The 2 aides who had been furniture became people again. James's thumb stopped its anxious loop. The pigeon in the courtyard, I swear to you, lifted its head. She came around the corner at the kind of pace that is technically unhurried but covers ground faster than you expect, a walk that has been refined over years into something that is neither performance nor function but somehow both at once. She was wearing something I wouldn't be able to accurately describe because the moment she turned the corner the thing you noticed was not what she was wearing. It was her face. It is always her face. There is something in it that doesn't read as celebrity or royalty or public figure, it reads as attention. As someone who is actually here, in the room, with you, and has decided that matters. She looked at me first because I was closest to the corner. You've been waiting. I'm sorry. The call ran long. Not a performance of an apology. An apology. Small distinction. Entire world. She shook my hand and then James's, and then she turned to direct an aide toward the meeting room, and it was in that turn, that simple, practical, redirecting turn, that I saw it. Her left hand. The ring. Now. Here is the thing about that ring that doesn't make it into the official record of the morning. Everyone in that world knows the history of that ring. You cannot be adjacent to the institution in any capacity without knowing it. Diana's ring. The sapphire. The detail that was so loaded and so deliberate and so absolutely freighted with everything that had happened between one generation and the next, that the moment William produced it in that garden in Kenya it stopped being jewelry and became something closer to a statement, a reckoning made wearable, slipped onto a finger, carried forward. But here is what photographs don't convey, and what I didn't fully understand until I was standing 3 feet away from it in that particular morning light: it is not a subtle object. It is enormous. Not in poor taste, not in the way that money shows off, it is enormous the way confidence is enormous, the way a decision made cleanly and without apology takes up more space than a decision made with hesitation. The sapphire is so deeply blue it reads almost black in certain lights, and then, when the light catches it the right way, it opens like something alive. It doesn't sit on the hand. It occupies the hand. It has the quality of something that knows exactly where it is and has no intention of going anywhere. I had seen photographs. I had seen footage. I thought I knew what it looked like. I did not know what it looked like. Catherine had turned back toward us, toward the aide, toward the room, and the light from the window found her hand at that specific angle, and the ring announced itself the way things announce themselves when they are not trying to, which is to say completely and without warning. The corridor went quiet in a way that was different from its usual quiet. And then, from the far end of the east wing, came the sound of heels. The moment Catherine, Princess of Wales, revealed her ring. Camilla was left speechless. A storytelling script. Part 2. She wasn't passing through the heels sounded like someone making a point. That is not a metaphor. Or it is, but it is also a literal description of the acoustics of a corridor where sound doesn't travel the way it should, and where those particular heels on that particular flooring produced a rhythm that had texture and weight and something that your nervous system registered as purposeful before your brain had finished processing it. Even the aides straightened. Not noticeably. The way people straighten when they don't want to be caught straightening. Camilla came around the far corner and she was, as the briefing had described, passing through. She was also, very clearly, not passing through. She had seen us. She had clocked the gathering, the little corridor assembly of people outside the East Wing meeting room, and she had made the decision in the space of a single stride to alter her trajectory. Not stop. Alter. She didn't break pace exactly. She adjusted it, the way a ship adjusts heading, the course change so gradual it looks like it was always going to happen. She had that thing, and I have since spent considerable time trying to find language for it that doesn't sound like either flattery or journalism, that certain people have when they have occupied very complicated territory for a very long time and have made their peace with the complications without exactly forgetting them. A settled quality. Not warmth, not coldness, but steadiness. The kind of person you could say almost anything to and they would hear all of it, including the parts you didn't say out loud. She reached Catherine, in a way that felt unhurried and was not. Catherine. A greeting that was also, somehow, a full sentence. Camilla. Same construction. Same compression. The two aides discovered something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. What happened in the next 45 seconds, I have replayed so many times that I have begun to distrust my own memory of it, which is how you know something was real. The replaying starts to sand down the details you're sure of, leaves the ones you weren't paying attention to suddenly, sharpened, vivid, so that now the thing I remember most clearly is not what was said, or what was done, but the way the light moved across the floor as clouds shifted somewhere above the courtyard, making the Corridor go briefly darker and, then, lighter again, the whole thing passing through like breath. They exchanged the standard formalities. How was the morning? Was the traffic? There is always traffic. There is somehow always traffic regardless of how many people have been dispatched to make there not be traffic. There was pleasantry. I am not going to pretend there was not pleasantry. But, underneath the pleasantry there was something else doing business, the way rivers have the surface you see and the current underneath that is doing the actual work. I was not the focus of this exchange. I was, in this exchange, functionally the pigeon. I watched anyway. Camilla was reaching past Catherine toward the aide, I think, something about a document or a schedule, and the gesture required her to lean slightly forward and to the left, which placed her eyes, briefly, at exactly the level and angle and proximity to catch the ring in the corridor's shifting light. She caught it. You could see the moment it registered. Not a dramatic reaction, nothing fell, no one gasped, no physical comedy announced the revelation. It was subtler and more interesting than that. It was the pause that happens when the brain encounters something it wasn't expecting and takes a fraction of a second longer than normal to process it. Less than a blink. More than nothing. Her hand, mid-reach, hovered. Just for a moment. A moment so small I would have missed it if I hadn't been standing exactly where I was, at exactly the useless angle of a person with nothing to do but observe, looking at the specific strip of air between the two of them where the light from the courtyard window was doing its strange, honest work. Camilla looked at the ring. The ring looked back, which is the only way I can describe what happens when that sapphire catches the right light. It looks back. It has mass and depth and that near black blue that opens into something else when you're not expecting it to, and, in that corridor, in that moment, it was open. It was all the way open. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that gets misread, the part that the headline flattens into something it wasn't, the part that becomes a story about tension or competition or the long complicated archaeology of one family's history with one ring. That is not what I saw. What I saw was more human than that. And more complicated. Camilla looked at the ring the way a person looks at something that carries an enormous weight of meaning and then chooses, consciously and completely, to hold that weight without putting it down and without pretending it isn't there. There was nothing performative about it. There was nothing hostile about it. There was just recognition of what the ring was. What it had been. What it now meant on this hand, in this corridor, in this iteration of a family that had taken a very long and very public road to reach anything resembling coherence. She was silent for longer than the social situation required. Not dramatically silent. Not pointedly silent. Silently silent, the way you go silent when you are actually inside a feeling instead of outside it, observing it. Catherine let her be. That is the detail I keep coming back to. Catherine let her be. She didn't fill the pause. She didn't redirect or deflect or produce a gracious comment to smooth the surface. She stood there, her left hand at her side, the ring doing its unsubtle work in the light, and she simply waited. Patiently. Completely. The gesture of someone who knows exactly what they're carrying and doesn't need to apologize for it, but who also understands what it costs someone else to look at it clearly. I have thought about what to call what passed between them in that corridor. I have considered acknowledgement. Understanding. A kind of negotiated peace conducted entirely without words, over the space of a few seconds, in a drafty East Wing corridor while two aides pretended to examine the floor and James stood slightly off to the side with his phone still in his hand and the pigeon outside continued to be entirely unbothered. None of those words are exactly right. What it was, I think, was honesty. The rarest currency in places like that. Two women who had lived in the full glare and the full shadow of a very specific history, and who had arrived, through the long grinding work of years, at some understanding of each other that did not require performance or pretense. The ring was there. It had always been going to be there. It was there now, in the light, on Catherine's hand, and Camilla was looking at it, and Catherine was letting her look. The clouds shifted again above the courtyard. The corridor went light. Camilla said something, then. Low and private. I am not going to pretend I heard it clearly, I am not going to manufacture dialogue for a scene I only partly witnessed. But, I heard the register of it. Warm. Dry, the way her humor often is, a little sand in the texture of the warmth. Whatever she said, it produced in Catherine a laugh that started in the chest and arrived in the face a full second later, the kind of laugh that is involuntary and, therefore, completely real. The pause broke. The corridor became a corridor again. The aides remembered they were people. James put his phone away. End of part 2 *# The moment Catherine, Princess of Wales revealed her ring ### Camilla was left speechless ### A storytelling script Part 3 The weight of sapphires. The meeting room was long and narrow and smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, and whoever had arranged the chairs had done so with more optimism than accuracy, leaving the table slightly off-center so that half the room had more space than it needed and half had less. Nobody moved the chairs. This is, I have learned, a fundamental law of these rooms: the chairs stay where they were placed, no matter how wrong they are, and everyone quietly adjusts to the wrongness. I found a seat on the side with less space. James took the side with more. This felt, in a very minor way, like information about us. Catherine sat at the head, or what functionally became the head the moment she sat there. Camilla, who had arrived at the meeting room door with us, this apparently being a passing through that extended for the length of an entirely different engagement, which no one remarked upon, took a chair slightly to the side, in the posture of someone who was present but not presiding, which is a posture I have only ever seen mastered by people who have spent decades in rooms where the distinction between the two matters enormously. The conversation began. The charitable initiative. The numbers, which were good. The expansion, which was planned. The various moving parts of a project that had begun quietly and grown into something that now carried its own momentum and required management the way anything with momentum requires management, carefully, and with respect for the fact that the thing is now larger than the people who started it. I was taking notes. I am always taking notes. It is a useful thing to be the person taking notes, because it gives you permission to watch without appearing to watch, and watching is what I do best and most naturally and, I think, most honestly. The ring was on the table. Not literally, I mean Catherine's hand was on the table, and therefore the ring was on the table, resting on the dark with the way it rested everywhere, which is to say with total unapologetic presence. In the meeting room's overhead light it looked different from how it had looked in the corridor, less dramatic, more settled, less a performance of itself and, more simply itself, the way people sometimes look in unflattering light, stripped of the ideal conditions, just existing without assistance. It still looked like a decision. I noticed, across the table, that one of the junior aides, a young woman, early 20s, the kind of barely suppressed enthusiasm that people have when they are very new to a room and cannot entirely believe they are in it, had noticed the ring too. She was trying very hard not to stare. She was failing entirely. Her eyes kept making these small disciplined journeys back toward her notes, and then, without her permission, back toward the ring. I felt a profound and instantaneous kinship with her. The meeting moved through its agenda. Points were raised. Questions were answered. Someone's phone buzzed and they looked at it with the expression of a person who has been told something they were hoping not to be told, and they typed a brief reply, and they put the phone face down with a particular finality that suggested the reply was not the end of it. Then, Camilla asked a question. It was a good question. That's the first thing, it was a genuinely good question, not a question asked for the purpose of being seen to ask, but a question that emerged from actual attention, that pushed against the edge of something that had been said and found the place where the logic didn't quite close, and it required a real answer. I noticed Catherine noticed this. A small adjustment of posture, the way you adjust when you're engaged rather than merely polite. The question was about a specific component of the program. Its long-term structural sustainability. Whether the model as designed could absorb growth without compromising the integrity of the original design, which is a question that sounds administrative but is actually a question about values, about whether the thing you built remains the thing you intended to build when it gets big enough to have opinions of its own. Catherine answered it at length. And something happened in the room while she answered, something that was entirely separate from the content of what she was saying and entirely about how she said it, a quality of fluency, of ownership, of knowing not just the data but the marrow of the thing. She talked about it the way you talk about something you built yourself in the dark, before anyone was watching, before it was worth watching, when it was just a shape in your head that you believed in without anyone else's confirmation. Camilla listened. And it was in the listening, in the quality of that specific listening, that the second version of the morning's speechlessness occurred. Not the corridor version, which had been brief and laden and about one specific object. This was quieter and lasted longer and was about something else entirely. Because here is what I think Camilla was looking at, across that too narrow, wrongly arranged table. She was looking at what a decade does. Not 10 years as measurement, 10 years as transformation. The woman across from her had arrived in this family as an entirely different proposition, young, careful, watched with a kind of merciless public scrutiny that I don't think anyone from outside those circles fully understands, the kind of scrutiny that doesn't just observe but actively seeks a failure, waits for it, has the headline already written. That scrutiny had lasted years. And, somewhere inside it, quietly and without announcement, something had happened that scrutiny of that kind rarely allows for. She had become herself. Completely, and without apology, and in such a thorough way that the self she'd become was not a reaction to the watching, wasn't shaped by resistance or performance or the careful construction of a persona, but was just, genuinely, who she was. That is hard to do. In a normal life it is hard enough. In that particular fishbowl, under those particular lights, it is a kind of achievement that I don't think ever gets named as one. Camilla had been watching this happen for years, from close range, from the specific vantage point of someone who also knew something about performing a version of yourself under observation and, then, one day, having the observation shift, having people look at you with different eyes, see different things, require a different story from you. She knew what that cost. She knew what it took. She was looking at a woman who had paid that cost and come off the other side of it holding something recognizably her own. The ring was part of it. But, only part. The ring was the visible version. This, the fluency, the ownership, the marrow knowledge of a project she'd built in the dark, this was the rest. Catherine finished speaking. A beat of silence. Not the corridor silence, which had been weighted and specific. This silence was different, it had the quality of the moment after a piece of music ends before the applause starts, when the room is still holding the sound and hasn't decided yet to release it. Camilla said, "That's good work." 3 words. Flat on the surface. Underneath them, everything. Catherine heard the underneath. I could see that she heard it, another of those small postural adjustments, a breath held an extra second. She said thank you, in a way that didn't shrink from the compliment or deflect it or qualify it with reflexive modesty, just received it, which is the thing most people are worst at receiving, credit for something real. The young aide was no longer looking at the ring. She was looking at Catherine's face. So was I. So, in a way that was not nothing and was not small, was Camilla. The meeting reached its natural end. Papers were gathered. The coffee cups, long empty, were abandoned. The chairs, still wrong, were pushed back at angles that were no more correct than the angles they'd been at before, and the room took on the slightly exhaled quality of a space that had just been used for something and hadn't yet decided what it was going back to being. I stood. Jane stood. The aides became furniture in reverse, remembered their legs. Catherine was saying something to the lead aide about a follow-up call, penciling a date, the business of the work continuing in its practical form beyond the meeting, and her left hand was in motion as she gestured, and the ring caught the overhead light one final time, and this time it was not the near-black version or the open sapphire version but something in between, not making a statement, not announcing itself, just there, doing its daily work of being present on the hand it belonged to. Ordinary and extraordinary. Both at once, which is the hardest thing to be. End of part 3 *.